Welcome back to the Deep Dive. Today we are wrestling with a policy that seems so simple on the surface, but wow, it gets complicated fast. We're talking about the minimum wage.
It really does. And it's everywhere, isn't it? I mean, the definition is straightforward. It's a price floor, the absolute lowest legal price an employer can pay someone for their labor.
And almost universal. Our sources say something like, what, over 90% of countries have some form of minimum wage?
That's right. Historically, the idea was pretty basic. Stop the worst kinds of exploitation, think sweatshops in the early industrial era, keep people from being utterly ground down.
But today the goals seem much bigger, right? It's framed more around reducing
Right.
poverty, tackling inequality.
Exactly. Much broader social aims now.
Mhm.
But that's where the conflict really kicks in immediately.
Yeah, the central tension. Is it this vital social safety net? Does it genuinely lift people's living standards? Or does it backfire? Does it mess with the labor market so much that it actually causes unemployment, especially hurting the lowest skilled workers it's supposed to protect?
That's the million-dollar question, isn't it? Or maybe the $15 an hour question these days. And honestly, decades of debate, tons of research, and it's still fiercely contested.
Okay, so that's our mission for this deep dive. We're going to try and unpack this. We'll look at the, frankly, pretty bizarre history of how we even got wage laws.
It's not what you'd expect.
Then we'll dig into the core economic arguments, the models that clash head on.
The textbook versus the more modern views.
And finally, we'll wade into the empirical evidence, the actual studies. Why is the data so messy? Why can different economists look at the same reality and come to, well, opposite conclusions?
It's a fascinating puzzle. And yeah, the history, it starts completely upside down from how we think about it now.
Right, you said it doesn't start with a floor, but a ceiling. Take us back,
Yeah.
way back, 1549.
Yeah, imagine medieval England. The Black Plague has just ripped through the country. Maybe a third, maybe even half the population is gone, just vanished.
Catastrophic.
Utterly. But think about the economic consequence. Suddenly, there's a massive labor shortage. If you're a peasant, a laborer who survived, your bargaining power just went through the roof.
Because landowners desperately needed workers for their fields.
Desperately. And so, wages started soaring, workers could demand more, and landowners had little choice but to pay or watch their harvests rot.
So the folks in charge, the wealthy landowners, the nobility, they panicked.
Big time. Their whole economic world was being upended. So King Edward III steps in and issues the Ordinance of Laborers. And this is the key point. It wasn't a minimum wage to help workers. It was a maximum wage.
A ceiling to stop wages from rising.
Precisely. It legally forbade employers from paying more than pre-plague levels, and it punished workers who demanded more. It was entirely about protecting the wealth and power of the landowners, keeping labor costs down, anti-worker, plain and simple.
That's incredible. So the very first major state intervention in wages was designed to suppress them. How does that eventually flip into the idea of a minimum, a floor?
It was a really slow, gradual evolution. The idea that the state could regulate wages kind of stuck around. Over centuries, subsequent laws and amendments tinkered with the system. Eventually, you get to the 17th century, and some local bodies that were initially set up to enforce maximum wages also started setting minimums.
Ah, okay.
And the goal started shifting. People began talking about ensuring a living wage, enough for workers to actually survive on. This gets formally recognized, for example, in 1604 with an act fixing a minimum wage specifically for textile workers. But that was still pretty localized.
So when does the modern concept, the national minimum wage as social policy, really take off?
You have to jump forward quite a bit to the late 19th century. The pioneers were actually in the Southern Hemisphere. New Zealand brought in a form of minimum wage legislation in 1894,
Okay.
and Australia followed very closely in 1896. And this time, the motivation was clearly what we recognize today, pushing back against sweatshop conditions, against that extreme exploitation happening in the new factories.
So it's about fairness, worker protection, giving them a bit more power.
Yes, exactly. Helping workers become more self-sufficient, less dependent on charity or parish relief. That's the root of the modern minimum wage movement.
But we have to address a darker side to the story, especially in the U.S. context. Around that same time, our sources point out that some early arguments for a minimum wage in America had, well, let's just say deeply problematic motivations.
Yes, and it's really important not to whitewash this part of the history. In the late 1800s, early 1900s, the U.S. was in the grip of the eugenics movement, these awful ideas about racial purity and undesirable populations.
And how did the minimum wage get tangled up in that?
Disturbingly, some prominent economists and social reformers who supported a minimum wage did so with an explicit eugenicist rationale. They argue that setting a wage floor high enough would effectively price certain workers out of the labor market.
Which workers?
They were targeting groups they considered unfit or undesirable. This often meant recent immigrants, Black Americans, people with disabilities. The thinking was, if these groups couldn't get jobs because employers wouldn't pay them the minimum, they wouldn't be able to support themselves, wouldn't thrive, wouldn't reproduce. It was seen by some as a tool for social engineering, for removing certain people from the workforce.
That is chilling. A policy that many today see as fundamentally about justice and fairness was, for some of its early proponents, about exclusion and discrimination.
It really underscores how a policy tool itself isn't inherently good or bad. Its intent and impact depend hugely on the context and the goals of those wielding it. And it makes understanding the economic arguments even more crucial.
Okay, let's pivot to that economic showdown then, because this is where the core of the modern debate lies. You open Econ 101, and what does it tell you about the minimum wage?
The textbook picture is crystal clear and pretty negative. It uses the standard supply and demand model. Model 1, let's call it.
Right, the graph we all had to draw. You treat labor like any commodity, like apples or widgets. There's a supply curve, workers willing to work, and a demand curve, employers willing to hire. They intersect at the equilibrium wage, the market rate.
Exactly. Let's say the market equilibrium for low-skilled labor is $10 an hour. Now the government comes in and says, nope, you have to pay at least $15. That's your price floor, set above the equilibrium.
And the model predicts
trouble. At $15 an hour, employers find labor more expensive, so they demand less of it. They'll hire fewer workers than they would have at $10. At the same time, more people are willing to work for $15 than for $10, so the supply of labor goes up.
Less demand, more supply. That means a surplus.
A surplus of labor, which, in plain English, is unemployment. The argument is that the minimum wage forces employers to lay off workers or not hire new ones they otherwise would have.
And specifically, it hits the least productive workers hardest, right? The ones whose actual contribution might only be worth, say, $12 an hour. Now the employer has to pay them $15, so it's a loss.
That's the classic argument. It prices the lowest skilled, the least experienced, the most marginalized workers right out of a job. It seems neat, logical, almost undeniable on that simple graph.
But if it were that simple, that universally true, surely we wouldn't still be debating this policy so intensely. Why didn't that model just end the discussion 50 years ago?
Great question. It's because that simple model relies on some pretty big assumptions. The main one is the assumption of perfect competition in the labor market.
Meaning workers and employers have equal power, perfect information, people can easily switch jobs, lots of employers competing for workers.
All of that. And economists started asking, does the real world actually look like that, especially for low-wage workers? And the answer increasingly was probably not.
So what's the alternative view, Model 2?
Model 2 introduces the concept of monopsony, or more realistically, monopsonistic competition.
Okay, monopoly is a single seller. Monopsony is a single buyer.
Essentially, yes. Or at least buyers, employers in this case, having significant market power over the sellers, the workers. Think about a small town dominated by one large factory, or maybe just a few fast food restaurants hiring similar workers.
Workers don't have many options.
Exactly. Finding a new job might mean moving, learning new skills, facing high search costs. There isn't perfect mobility. Employers know this, so they don't have to pay the workers their full marginal revenue product, what they're truly worth to the company. They can pay less because where else are the workers going to go easily?
So the employers have wage-setting power. They can push wages down below the theoretically competitive level.
Precisely. Workers are getting paid less than they should be in a perfectly competitive world. Now, in this scenario, introducing a minimum wage can have a completely different effect.
How so?
If the minimum wage is set moderately, say, somewhere between the low monopsony wage the employer was paying and the worker's actual productivity value, it can actually force the employer to behave differently.
Instead of cutting jobs.
It can actually lead to an increase in employment up to a certain point. The employer was hiring fewer workers than optimal because they were keeping wages artificially low. The minimum wage removes their ability to do that for the lowest paid roles. It pushes the wage up, makes hiring those workers more attractive relative to keeping wages suppressed, and they might end up hiring more people to reach the optimal level at that mandated wage.
Wow. Okay, so the minimum wage acts as a counterweight to the employer's power, potentially boosting both wages and jobs. That's completely opposite to the textbook story.
It is. And it suggests that a moderate increase might not have those negative employment effects the simple model screams about. It crucially depends on how much market power employers actually have.
And there's another criticism of the simple model, isn't there? About looking at just one market.
Right. The textbook model usually assumes a single unified labor market. But economists like Gary Fields pointed out that's not realistic either. You usually have at least two sectors. The covered sector, where the minimum wage law applies, like fast food, retail, and the uncovered sector, like agriculture, domestic work, maybe the informal gig economy.
So what happens then?
If the minimum wage rises in the covered sector and some jobs are lost there, those workers don't just disappear. They might move over to the uncovered sector looking for work,
Which increases the labor supply in the uncovered sector.
driving wages down there. So the overall employment number might not change much, but you haven't really solved the poverty problem. You've just shifted it around, potentially making things worse for workers in the sectors not protected by the minimum wage.
So even theoretically, it's ambiguous.
Yeah.
It depends on employer power. It depends on multiple sectors. No wonder the theory alone doesn't settle it.
Exactly, which is why everyone eventually turns to the empirical evidence. Let's look at the real world. Let's measure what actually happens.
And this is where things get really messy, right? The academic battlefield.
Oh, yeah. For a long time, maybe up until the early 1990s, there was a sort of fragile consensus among economists leaning towards the classic model. Most believed minimum wages probably did reduce employment, especially for young people and low-skilled workers. It wasn't seen as a great anti-poverty tool.
But then came the earthquake.
Then came Card and Kruger. David Card and Alan Kruger, two highly respected economists. In 1992, they published a study that just blew the doors off the consensus.
This is the famous New Jersey-Pennsylvania study.
That's the one. It was beautifully simple in its setup, what economists call a natural experiment, or a quasi-experiment. New Jersey decided to raise its state minimum wage quite significantly, from $4.25 to $5.05 an hour.
Okay.
Right next door, Pennsylvania decided not to raise its minimum wage. It stayed at $4.25. You have a perfect comparison group.
You can look at similar businesses right across the state line. Yeah.
Exactly. Card and Kruger focused on the fast food industry, a big employer of minimum wage workers. They surveyed hundreds of restaurants in New Jersey and eastern Pennsylvania before the wage hike in NJ, and then again several months after.
And standard theory predicted what? Fewer jobs in New Jersey restaurants compared to Pennsylvania.
Absolutely. Clear prediction. Employment growth should be slower or maybe even negative in New Jersey relative to Pennsylvania because labor just got more expensive there.
And what did they find?
Their initial results, based on calling up managers and asking about staffing levels, were stunning. They found no evidence of job loss in New Jersey. In fact, their data suggested a slight increase in employment in New Jersey fast food restaurants compared to Pennsylvania.
An increase. So the minimum wage hike was correlated with more jobs.
That's what their first pass suggested. It directly contradicted the textbook model and decades of prior assumption. Their book, Myth and Measurement, became incredibly influential and controversial. It basically launched the modern minimum wage debate as we know it.
I can imagine the reaction. That must have sent shockwaves through the economics profession.
Oh, absolutely. It was huge. And immediately, it drew criticism. Other economists, notably David Newmark and William Washer, jumped on the study. They questioned the methodology relying on surveys of managers who might misremember or misreport staffing numbers.
What do they do differently?
Newmark and Washer got access to actual payroll data from a sample of restaurants. So not what managers said, but the actual records of hours worked and employees paid.
And their analysis of the payroll data showed.
They found the opposite of Card and Kruger. Their analysis suggested that the New Jersey minimum wage hike did lead to a decrease in employment relative to Pennsylvania.
So the data war began right there. Same event, different data sources, different results.
Precisely. And it highlights a fundamental problem in this kind of research. It's incredibly difficult to isolate the specific effect of the minimum wage from everything else happening in the economy. You've got local booms and busts, seasonal hiring patterns, changes in consumer demand, new technologies coming in. Trying to statistically filter all that out to find the pure minimum wage effect is really, really hard.
So where does that leave us now? It's been 30 years since Card and Kruger. We've had countless more studies, more data, more sophisticated methods. Is there any consensus today?
It's complicated. The old consensus is definitely broken. You won't find many economists today who confidently assert, like they might have in the 80s, that minimum wages always cause significant unemployment. But a new consensus is still debated.
Okay, what's the general drift, though, if you look at the big picture?
If you look at meta-analyses, these are studies that try to synthesize the results of hundreds of individual minimum wage studies, particularly from developed countries like the US, UK, Canada. A general picture does emerge.
And that is,
After controlling for various study designs and, importantly, correcting for publication bias, the tendency for studies showing statistically significant effects to get published more often, many recent meta-analyses find that the impact on employment is surprisingly small.
small. Like how small?
Often, the estimated effects are statistically indistinguishable from zero. Economists talk about the elasticity of labor demand with respect to the minimum wage. An elasticity of zero means a change in the wage has no effect on the quantity of labor demanded, employment. Many modern estimates cluster very close to zero.
Okay, let's break down elasticity near zero for everyone listening. What does it actually mean in practice? If a city raises its minimum wage by, say, 10%.
An elasticity of -0.1, for example, which is a common kind of estimate in recent literature for overall employment, would mean that a 10% increase in the minimum wage leads to only a 1% decrease in employment for the affected group. An elasticity of zero means that 10% increase leads to, well, a 0% change in employment.
So very small job losses, or potentially none at all, on average.
That seems to be where a lot of the recent evidence points for moderate increases in developed economies. At the same time, these studies consistently find that minimum wage hikes do significantly increase the earnings of low-paid workers who keep their jobs.
So the takeaway is, maybe the trade-off isn't as harsh as the simple model suggests. You get higher wages for many with minimal overall job destruction.
That's the optimistic reading of much of the recent literature, yes. But, and this is a huge but minimal overall effect doesn't mean no negative consequences or that everyone benefits. The details really matter.
Right. Things are never that clean. Let's talk about those nuances. The Seattle study from 2017 is often brought up as a cautionary tale, isn't it? They went for a pretty high wage, $13 an hour at the time.
Yes, the University of Washington study on Seattle's phased-in minimum wage increase is crucial. They had incredibly detailed data covering not just employment, but actual hours worked and total earnings for low-wage workers.
And what did they find when the wage hit $13?
They found something quite worrying. While the hourly wage went up, as expected, businesses responded by significantly cutting worker hours. So people were earning more per hour, but working fewer hours.
And the net effect on their paychecks?
For the lowest wage workers, total earnings actually decreased on average. They ended up taking home less money overall, even though their hourly rate was higher.
Ouch. So the policy backfired in terms of actual income for the target group?
In that specific instance, for that significant jump to $13, the evidence suggested it did. It showed that employers might adjust not just by firing people, but by reducing hours, which can have the same negative impact on a worker's total income.
That's a really important wrinkle. What about the cost? Who pays for the wage increase, if not through job cuts or hour reductions? Does it just get passed on to consumers?
That's another major pathway. And yes, there's strong evidence that happens, especially in industries with lots of minimum wage workers, like restaurants.
You mentioned a McDonald's study.
Yeah, a study looking at Big Mac prices across the U.S. between 2016 and 2020 found a pretty clear link. A 10% increase in the local minimum wage was associated with about a 1.4% increase in the price of a Big Mac.
So companies aren't necessarily absorbing the cost out of their profits. They're passing at least some of it on to customers in the form of higher prices.
Exactly, which means that the real wage gain for the minimum wage worker is less than the nominal gain. Their paycheck goes up, but the cost of things they buy also goes up slightly, eroding some of that purchasing power.
Okay, so we have potential job losses, potential hour reductions, potential price increases. It seems like a complex web of effects. How does something like the Congressional Budget Office try to synthesize all this when looking at a big proposal, like the $15 federal minimum wage idea?
The CBO projections are always interesting because they try to balance these competing effects based on the broad range of economic studies. Their 2021 report on a hypothetical federal $15 minimum wage by 2025 really illustrated the trade-offs starkly.
What were their headline numbers?
On the positive side, they estimated it would lift about 900,000 people out of poverty. A huge number, a significant social benefit.
But the downside?
They also projected it would lead to a reduction in employment of approximately 1.4 million people. So nearly 1 million people moved out of poverty, but potentially 1.4 million fewer jobs available overall compared to a scenario without the wage hike.
Wow. That puts the dilemma in sharp focus, doesn't it? A clear win for some, a clear loss for others?
It really does. It shows that even if the net effect on total national income might be debated, the policy creates distinct winners and losers. And that 1.4 million job reduction figure, even if it's just a projection, is a serious potential cost that policymakers have to weigh. It's not evenly distributed pain.
Absolutely. Okay, let's broaden out from just wages and employment. What are some of the other consequences, positive and negative, that come up in the debate?
Well, on the positive side, proponents obviously stress the improved standard of living for those who get the raise, the reduction in poverty and inequality we just discussed.
Makes sense.
They also argue it can boost worker morale and productivity. Happier workers might stick around longer, which reduces costly turnover and training for businesses.
Okay, lower turnover, that's a potential saving for firms.
And some argue it can actually spur innovation. If low-skilled labor becomes more expensive, businesses have a stronger incentive to invest in technology, in automation, in finding more efficient ways to do things.
But that cuts both ways, right? The flip side of encouraging automation is replacing workers with machines.
Exactly. That's a major concern on the negative side. Minimum wage hikes might accelerate the adoption of things like self-checkout kiosks, automated ordering systems, maybe even robotics in warehousing or cleaning. These directly replace jobs often held by low-skilled workers.
And it potentially makes it harder for people to get that first rung on the ladder, doesn't it? If entry-level jobs are automated away.
That's a key argument. It might disproportionately harm younger workers or those with fewer skills or less experience by essentially eliminating the jobs where they could have gained that initial experience and built a work history. They're competing against a machine that now looks cheaper relative to the mandated wage.
Are there any other, maybe less obvious, social impacts? I think our sources mentioned some links to health and crime.
Yeah, some interesting research there. Some studies have found correlations between minimum wage increases and positive social outcomes. For instance, a decline in the growth rate of suicides has been linked to minimum wage hikes.
Really? How might that work?
The theory is increased economic security and reduced financial stress can have positive effects on mental health for vulnerable populations. Similarly, other studies have found that higher minimum wages are associated with reduced recidivism, meaning fewer ex-prisoners reoffending specifically for property and drug crimes.
So, providing a legal, even if minimal source of income stability might reduce the pressure to turn back to crime.
That's the hypothesis. Giving people a foothold in the formal economy, even at the minimum wage level, could offer a viable alternative to illegal activities driven by desperation. So, potential benefits for public health and safety, too.
Fascinating. So, given all this complexity, economic ambiguity, mixed empirical results, these wider social effects, how do different countries actually implement minimum wage policies? Is it always just a law passed by the government like in the US or the UK?
Not at all. That legislative approach is common, but there's a completely different model used in several very successful high-income countries, particularly in Scandinavia and parts of Europe.
Which countries are those?
Think about Sweden, Denmark, Finland, Italy, Austria. None of them have a statutory government-mandated national minimum wage law.
No minimum wage law at all. How do they protect low-wage workers then?
They rely heavily on a system of collective bargaining. Essentially, powerful trade unions negotiate wages directly with employer associations, industry by industry, sometimes region by region.
So unions and business groups hammer out the minimum pay rates themselves.
Exactly. These collective agreements are legally binding and typically cover a very large percentage of the workforce, even non-union members in those sectors. They effectively set wage floors, but through negotiation rather than legislation. The argument is that this allows for more flexibility, tailoring wages to the specific conditions of different industries.
Interesting. So different ways to achieve a similar goal.
Yeah.
Now, what about alternatives? If the minimum wage is such a blunt or controversial tool, what else do economists propose to help low-income workers or reduce poverty?
There are several main alternatives that get discussed. Probably the most prominent one, especially in U.S. policy debates, is the refundable tax credit approach.
Like the Earned Income Tax Credit, the EITC.
Precisely. The EITC provides a wage subsidy through the tax system, primarily to low and moderate income working families with children. The key argument for it, compared to the minimum wage, is that it's much better targeted at reducing poverty.
How so?
Well, the minimum wage benefits anyone earning it, regardless of their household income. That includes, say, a teenager from a wealthy family working a summer job. They get the raise, but it does little to reduce overall poverty. The EITC, on the other hand, is specifically designed to boost the incomes of low-income households. It directs the money where the need is greatest.
And it avoids the potential employment distortions of the minimum wage, right?
Yeah.
Because it's a government subsidy, not a mandate on employers.
That's the idea. It supplements low wages without directly interfering with the price of labor between the employer and employee, hopefully avoiding those potential job losses or hour reductions. Many economists across the political spectrum actually prefer the EITC to the minimum wage as an anti-poverty tool for this reason.
Okay, what other alternatives are out there?
Well, you get into broader social safety net ideas. One that gets a lot of attention is universal basic income, UBI, or a guaranteed minimum income, GMI.
Giving everyone a basic floor of income, regardless of work status.
Yes. The argument here is that providing that basic security fundamentally changes the power dynamic for workers. If you know you won't face utter destitution if you lose or leave a job, you have much more bargaining power. You can afford to turn down exploitative wages, hold out for a better job, or maybe invest time in education or training.
It removes that desperation factor.
Exactly. It gives people the freedom to say no to bad jobs, which theoretically forces employers to offer better wages and conditions to attract workers.
And then there's the perhaps most fundamental solution.
Education and training always comes back to this, doesn't it? If you can provide people with the skills and qualifications needed for higher paying jobs, you tackle the root cause of low wages. They become more productive, their market value increases naturally, and they move out of the minimum wage bracket altogether.
Focusing on apprenticeships, vocational training, access to higher education.
Things like the German apprenticeship model are often cited. Investing in human capital is arguably the most sustainable long-term solution to low wages, though it doesn't provide the immediate relief that something like a minimum wage hike aims for.
Okay, so wrapping this all up,
Hmm.
what have we learned from this deep dive? It feels like the minimum wage started almost by accident.
Yeah, from medieval price controls aimed at suppressing wages.
Evolved into a tool against sweatshops, got complicated by some ugly early motivations,
Crashed into contradictory economic theories.
and landed us in a 3-decade empirical war where the data seems to whisper small effects on average, but the real-world consequences, hour cuts, price hikes, job shifts, are incredibly complex and unevenly distributed.
That sums it up pretty well. The old certainty is gone. The debate now isn't really whether it has effects, but what kind of effects, where they show up, and who bears the cost versus who gets the benefit. It's incredibly nuanced.
The consensus definitely fractured around the time of Card-Kruger and hasn't really reformed since.
No, it remains one of the most actively debated high-stakes policy areas. Every time a city or state proposes a significant hike, the same arguments, the same studies, the same uncertainties get trotted out again because the stakes are so high for millions of workers and businesses.
Which leaves us, and you listening, with a final thought to chew on. Something maybe looking forward.
The landscape is changing rapidly.
Exactly. We're seeing this huge rise in the gig economy. Uber drivers, delivery workers, freelancers who often fall outside traditional employment structures and minimum wage laws. At the same time, automation is getting smarter, cheaper, and more capable of doing tasks that used to be entry-level human jobs.
Right. Robots flipping burgers, AI handling customer service.
So the provocative question for you is this. In a future where the nature of work itself is shifting so dramatically, with more people in non-standard employment and automation potentially displacing many low-wage roles,
Yeah.
how do policymakers ensure a basic standard of living, a living wage, when the traditional tools like the minimum wage might cover fewer people or become less relevant?
What does a wage floor even mean when employment itself is being redefined? That's the challenge ahead.
Definitely something to think about. Thank you for joining us for this deep dive.
Thanks for having me.
We'll see you next time.